The Python Show.
Hello, and welcome to the Python Show with your host, Mike Driscoll. That's me. Today we have a wonderful new guest, Doug Farrell, who has written a wonderful Python book called The Well-Grounded Python Developer. We're just going to talk to him a little bit about his book and his journey in Python today. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Thanks, Mike. I'm very glad to be here.
It's great to have you as well. I think we'll just kind of kick off the show and ask you, to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to programming.
Sure, I've been programming for a long time, probably a scary long time since 1983. So coming up on 40 years. I began as doing microcomputers like Radio Shack Color Computer was my real introduction to computing, and then that helped me learn enough buzzwords to get my first job as a process control engineer, where they had their own proprietary language, and I really enjoyed that. And that also involved doing some Pascal work, and I did well enough at that to transfer to their software development group and never looked back. And I've been developing software ever since. At that point,
Cool.
I was doing C and Fortran, and then I moved into C++ and was working in embedded systems doing machine control with C++. And then I
Hmm.
moved to an internet group. Was making, I don't know, back in the day, I don't remember if you remember the Encarta,
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft encyclopedia. I was
Yep.
working for a competitor of theirs, the Grolier Encyclopedia, doing CD-ROM retail software. And then eventually for them, we moved to
Hmm.
their internet group, where we were, that was where I first got introduced to Python. We were doing some PHP work for
Mm-hmm.
their online web references. And they were also looking at Perl, and I was horrified by Perl. So I was looking for something else, and I was fortunate that I discovered Python, and it really fit the way I think. I was very
Mm-hmm.
much uh, had both feet in the object-oriented programming world, and Python's built-in support for OOP type programming really fit my brain well. And
Yeah.
so that was like in 2001. And
Hmm.
although it wasn't my main language at the time, I did a lot of Python work at that job. And then in 2006, I moved to a company that eventually became part of Shutterfly, where I was doing
Hmm.
Python exclusively and JavaScript.
I'm
And
curious, which version of Python was it in 2001?
oh, this was way back, Python 2.5
I think
I was
2.5 came
working with.
out in 2006 when I started doing
Oh, was it?
Python. So
It might have been 2.3 even earlier. It's a long
I was
time
going to
ago.
say, huh, interesting. Anyway, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt your story. I
No,
just
that's
was
all
like,
right.
that's
It
interesting.
was Yeah, I mean, it's as I say in my book, Python hits the sweet spot for me in programming. It's fast to develop in. I can sort of almost think right from in
Mm-hmm.
thoughts to code, and it executes the object-oriented nature of it, and then that's its support for functional style programming, and just the ease and expressiveness of the language really suits me. And I don't think although I really enjoyed my C and C++ work because I used to be a speed freak uh,
Mm-hmm.
with embedded systems trying to eke more work out of computer cycles. I don't really want
Yeah.
to go back to that kind of work.
Yeah, that always sounded like really hard work to me.
It was fun. I worked on a machine that it was a pick and place machine for building circuit boards, and it was moving pretty fast, 20,000 parts an hour.
Oh,
So it was
wow.
really moving very quickly, very fast. And although that's fun and challenging, um, building a thing like that, and at that time it was DOS and then
Mm-hmm.
Windows. Eventually, you run into the problem where you just like 90% of your time is spent trying to code things to keep the thing from crashing.
Yeah. I'm curious, since you mentioned Fortran and C, is there like a speed difference? How do you compare those languages?
Fortran has it has nice libraries. At least that's how I vision it. That people like it because it has a
Okay.
lot of nice libraries for computational stuff. And it was odd because what we were using it for was not that at all. So it didn't really fit the bill for doing. I don't know about you, but I feel like a
Hmm.
great deal of my life is centered around string manipulation with
Mm-hmm.
code, and Fortran doesn't really do that all that well. But
Huh.
it is fast. I would say it's comparable for certain things to C. Um,
Hmm.
in C++, I felt that C++ got the performance wasn't as high, but on the other hand, the safety mechanisms that you could take advantage of with C++ were worth it for the small degradation in speed.
Hmm.
Smart pointers and the standard library containers and things like that, uh,
Hmm.
which you'd have to handle if you could thought of it, you'd have to handle by yourself in straight C code.
Yeah, interesting. I wish I had this conversation with my old coworker who used to be a COBOL programmer.
Oh
So
my,
I'm
yeah.
always curious. When I was in school, like the year before I went to do my university, they just got rid of the Fortran class, and I was like, what am I missing out on here? Am I missing out on anything? So
I don't think
anyway,
so. Oh, I remember. I have a story about COBOL if you want to hear it. Um,
sure.
I was my first exposure to Fortran was back in the punch card days, IBM punch cards,
Hmm.
and the way it worked, you had to take your deck of cards downstairs and hand them over to a mean-faced person who would put them in the machine, and you couldn't get close to the computer. You just hand over the cards and off you go.
Mm,
And because it was downstairs in the library, it was a typical school building with the hard marble stairs, hard marble floor, so it could be slippery. While I was
hmm.
down there, waiting for my turn to hand over my little deck of like 20 Fortran cards, someone came downstairs with their COBOL program, which essentially did the same thing as mine, like just a double iteration through a table. And
Okay.
but it was an armful of cards. It was a whole box, like a foot and a half long of cards,
Wow.
and they slipped, and the cards went flying all over the floor,
Ah,
and it was a woman, and she burst into tears. And as far as I know, she quit the program because she
yeah.
couldn't she couldn't bear to resort them back in order.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of boilerplate in COBOL. I
Oh
did a
my!
I did a little bit of that in college, but not very much. Huh.
But
So
that
what do
was my
you
exposure to COBOL.
That's funny. Yeah, I hear COBOL's still a good language to know if you have to deal with insurance or banking.
Yeah, it's still big in a lot of industries because of legacy systems.
Yeah. So anyway, getting back to more modern languages, why are you still using Python?
Well, like I said, it still hits the sweet spot. I mean, one of the things that I've found is, you occasionally get into conversations where people talk about, well, Python is this or Python is slow, and one of the things they talk about in comparison to this language or that language. But from my point of view, we're long past the tipping point where the speed of the CPU is the crucial on the critical path. I'm the one that's on the critical path. My ability to produce code and hit market windows is more important than some fast piece of code. And
Yeah.
Python's been fast enough for the kinds of things that I want to build, and I've built a lot of stuff. I'm build websites, computation
Hmm.
stuff, quick scripts, to automate the boring stuff kind of scripts.
Hmm.
A lot of processes like that, and just the ability to quickly deliver, turn stuff around, deliver well formatted, well thought out code quickly. And
Hmm.
then the other thing that's everybody's aware of who's a programmer is that change is a constant. And what I mean by not the language, but the requirements of a program are constantly
Yes.
changing. Uh, and somebody wants it to do this or somebody wants it to do that. And for me, I mean, it's part of my experience is to try to build code that's flexible and extensible. But Python really helps that you can
Yeah.
keep the code agile so that it can accommodate future requests. It's pointless to try to anticipate the future in code. Just
Mhm.
meet the requirements with a smart infrastructure, and then you're able to adapt for a long time before it becomes unsustainable.
I have had pretty much the same experience with Python. In almost all cases, it's been more than fast enough, and if it isn't,
Yeah,
it's almost always because the developers did something wrong. You know,
yeah,
there has been a few cases, but again, it's usually like, oh, that's the database that needs to be fixed, not the
exactly.
Python.
Yeah, I mean, if you think
So
about it, a database is orders of magnitude slower than the CPU and the program.
yes, and there's usually a lag because you're communicating with another device.
Especially,
So,
these days, a lot of my work is all in the cloud. So you have lots of crosstalk between different applications through queues
hmm
and networks. So those account for a lot more of the time in a program than the programming language.
yeah. Huh. Well, we're going to change the topics just a little bit and talk
Okay.
about how your book, The Well-Grounded Python Developer, came about.
Well, it's also a long, tortured story. No, it started out a long time ago when I was at Shutterfly. Uh, I got involved in giving talks about Python at
hmm
the all hands engineering meetings that we would have, and they were pretty well received. As you can tell, I'm a gas bag and could go on and on, and can be somewhat entertaining speaking. So what happened? I got after the first one, we would have these all hands meetings twice a year, and I was asked every
hmm
time I would be asked to give a presentation, and I put something together that would be interesting, and I was getting good feedback about that. And
Yeah.
when I thought about it, I said, well, maybe I could turn these presentations into an article. And
hmm
I did. I got in touch with Dan Bader, who had his own site, danbader.org. This was before he acquired the Real Python site.
hmm
And he and I got to talking, and I wrote a couple of articles for his site. And then
Nice.
he took over Real Python, and I converted some of those articles to Real Python, and
Hmm.
the Real Python site updated them. And then
Yeah.
I wrote 5 or 6 other articles that were well received. And
Cool.
and then all of a sudden, this fella from Manning Publications got in touch with me because he had read the articles, and he approached me about the idea of writing a book, which I hadn't really thought of because it's a huge commitment, and I was right
hmm
about that guesswork. Uh,
Yep.
and he and I got to talking about the kinds of book that I would want to write, and the market and where I thought things were going. And before you know it, I was on the hook for a book. And so that's how it got started. That was I think more than 3 years ago now,
hmm
uh, to actually start creating the book and the
Yeah.
kinds of things I wanted to say in the book.
So, I can't tell just by looking at the title. What exactly is the book talking about?
Well, it's a we had a lot of discussions about the title, and it's like, okay, you end up like, oh, we want to say what the book does, and you end up with a title that's 100 words long, so it doesn't really work. But for me, I didn't want to create a how to write programs in Python, a beginner's book. There's lots of really good
Yes.
beginners books and resources out there for that, and I didn't want to do that. But what I did want to do was I wanted to help people think uh, bigger picture. So that in my mind, I thought if I want to help a person who thinks of themselves as a programmer, maybe they've written one file Python script to do something to make their life easier. I want to help move them from being a programmer to being a developer and be able to take on bigger projects, to think about the big picture. How do they break up a big project into manageable pieces? How do they structure the code so it is manageable? How
Yeah.
do they, Python's often thought of as a glue language. How do they glue lots of technologies together to create a large application like, a web server? And it led to my choice of a demonstration app. How do I create a web server? How do I connect that to a database? How do I deliver that data to the user? Um, that was the kinds of things I wanted to talk about. So the book is split into 2 halves. There's a groundwork phase, which I talk about
Okay.
just general uh, from my point of view, valuable things to know as a Python developer, like namespaces, uh, naming conventions for variables, how
Yeah.
to how to handle exceptions, how to create exceptions, what the purpose of exceptions are. All of our programs exist in the real world, so you have to handle problems that either bugs, user input, changes in the environment that your program's running in.
hmm
Um, I also had a large section on just databases, which is just abstract, tangential to the thrust of the book. Just to
Yeah.
talk about databases in general, like why you would want to use a database instead of a CSV file instead, for data persistence.
Yeah.
And then the second half of the book is all about creating a demonstration app to pull all these topics together. Um,
Okay.
to create a web application, a blogging application, which is not, it's certainly not cutting edge. There's lots of ones that you could just download and run. But how do you think
Hmm.
about putting one of those things together? And it goes from ground zero, a simple Flask application, um,
Okay.
to adding authentication, adding pages, how the authentication could be used to protect the pages, uh,
Hmm.
having the user stored in a database, access to a database, and then eventually having being able to add user content and then allow people to comment on that
Yeah.
content. And all of that's saved in the database for the final application, which was a lot of fun. I think useful. It does make the book like half about Flask, but I don't think that that's not a bad idea. I think it's a pretty good approach.
Yeah, and it also shows, how to add new features without,
Yeah,
screwing up your code,
yeah.
which I
I
like.
used like Flask blueprints. I use that as kind of the Flask way of doing namespaces to separate out code into namespaces so that it becomes manageable. So you can keep your thought domain on one thing. Like authentication is one blueprint, so you can just think about authentication there. It's not mixed in with everything.
Yeah.
Generating content is one blueprint. Information about the app, like the about page and things like that, are separate namespaces.
Okay. Cool. Nice. So, what are some key things you learned when you were writing this book?
Well, it was so much work.
Yeah.
One of the key things I learned was that my wife has tremendous patience. Uh, she, as one of the jokes that we tell quite often, is that she's very proud of me about the book, but she has about this much tolerance for it anymore.
Yeah. They take a
But
lot of work.
it does take a lot of work. I had to dedicate. I had in the course of writing the book, I had two job changes, and I have a full-time job, which is demanding, and a family life that's demanding. So there's a lot of nights and weekends in writing the book. One of the other things I found was writing a technical book is like writing two books. You have the content, the written content, but then there's the example programs, which my book has a lot of, is like
Yep.
another whole book, which you have to in sync with the written content and make sure it works and up to date.
Hmm.
So like, that's a real process.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I've I don't know if you did this, but whenever I'm working on even not just regular articles, I typically will write all of the examples ahead of time and before I start actually writing, a chapter or an article.
I did quite a bit of that. I usually wrote examples like at least one chapter ahead, if not two,
Hmm.
which kind of it helped minimize having to go back and modify code when you ran into problems.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I used to. My old way of writing was I'll write the intro and then I'll write the code and then I'll write some more. And boy, do you get in trouble when you do that. So I
Yeah,
stopped doing that.
yeah. I probably should have done the whole write the code all the way through it in one go because I did have to end up partly because the editorial process towards the end of the book there was a lot of reorganizing chapters or splitting big chapters into two, which made taking the code apart to fit the chapter layout was kind of a problem.
Yeah. 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 You have to be real careful with that. Huh. So here's
So that,
a related topic. Oh well, actually, I'm going to back up before I go to the next question.
sure.
Now that your book is out there, have you gotten any feedback from readers that
I have gotten
pros
a little bit of
cons?
feedback. It's mostly people I know, or who people who are following me on LinkedIn or whatever, who sort of see my commentary. And whenever I published a new article on Real Python, they were following me already. So I've gotten some good feedback. People seem to enjoy the book. Um, I'm hopeful to get more feedback from in the wild, so to speak, from people who don't know me and may not be so kind to see what they really think. So we'll see.
Yeah, one thing from one author to another that I would avoid doing is, for the most part, is probably reading the really negative reviews because they really kind of hurt. So
Yeah, I did have somebody. This was I think a year ago, put together a pretty harsh comment on Twitter about the book, and I was like, oh man. So I got in touch with my development editor at Manning, and they said, that guy's only got 12 followers. Don't worry about it. Okay.
yeah, 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 you got to be real careful because I don't know why it is as humans, but you get one or two bad comments and you have 1,000 good ones, and those two bad ones just stick out all for a long time.
Yeah, I
But
had was well. I'm sure you had this experience. I had quite a bit of feedback from technical reviewers that Manning got in touch with, and so I would say about half of that I have to really take with a grain of salt because although the commentary was really useful, sometimes it was clear that the commenter was really focused on their domain, their problem domain or where they work or the kinds of
mm,
things that they do, and like my
yep,
book doesn't fit that. I'm like, well, no, it's not intended for that.
yep, yep. I've seen that as well. All right, now I'm ready to change the topic slightly.
Okay.
So, um, so what have you been learning as a real Python contributor? Like, what's different about that whole process versus like writing a book?
Um, you mean like adding to the Python world community?
Well, just being part of the real Python community.
Oh, well, it's the real Python community is. I really enjoy working with those guys. I don't know if you know Ger Arna. He's one of the editors there. He edited my last article. He is really great. He's really terrific. He really knows his stuff. He's also an incredibly tough editor. Oh my God, the article I wrote took months to pass muster with him.
Yeah,
But it came out to be a very good and I think well received article. Those guys are really know their stuff technically and will call you out and to improve, make sure the quality of the article is really good. Um, they don't worry so much about marketing stuff or the marketing window. Whereas working with Manning, that was kind of a constant conversation. Like, where does my book fit in the market? Has the market changed? And with articles, it's a kind of a short term. It's a couple months before you publish an article. With a book, it's a couple years, and you get questions like, "Is your book still relevant? Is
yeah,
it meet the market? Who's the intended reader?" Because of the length of time it takes to write a book, and that those questions came up, and I don't know if you have to say like I had to defend myself, but those questions did come up in the life of writing, in the span of writing the book.
that's interesting. Yeah, the little bit I've had in real publishing is that I didn't have that problem because one was buying the rights to my book and they just kind of remixed it, and the other one didn't seem to care about the market. They were just like, "This is what we want, and we'll publish it when we want to," and so I didn't have that problem. But
That's interesting. Yeah, these guys were very concerned about it was part of why the conversation about changing the title all the time was like make it more relevant. And towards the end of the book,
yeah,
they had kind of were hinting at adding Fast API to the book to do some asynchronous code. I'm like, it's really kind of, I would do a disservice if I was just to add one chapter about that. That should sort of be out of left field.
yeah, huh. That's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I kind of avoid writing about web programming in general is because of that problem you were talking about with your book. Is I'm afraid by the time I get the article put together or even published, or even on my own website, it'll probably be obsolete within the next 6 months. And
It is a problem.
I'm like, who's going to read this? And then I'm just going to get bug reports forever unless I go back and keep it up to date.
Well, I did. I worked very hard to keep the requirements modules up to date as much as I could, so that by the time the book was published, it was pretty close to current with like Flask and SQL Alchemy and things like that. But yeah,
Yeah,
and I did pin the modules I'm using in the requirements, so
yeah,
um, it'll stay running for a long time. It may and hopefully stay relevant because
yeah.
those things might at least you can see how it runs even if it falls out of date as far as the pace of change in the Python world.
Yeah, that was one thing I didn't do for my. There was a book before last that I should have pinned the Open Pixel version I was using for that book. I didn't do it, and the examples work if you use my input, but if you use other input, they don't work the same way, which is
Yeah,
really interesting. But
yeah, I wanted to
yeah,
avoid
well,
that. It caused me some stress. I was because occasionally I would update the requirements to some new module, and all of a sudden I'd have to work all the way through my example code to make sure everything's still working. Sometimes it didn't.
yeah. that's something I probably need to write about is how do you write tests for your book so that
Yeah.
you can check to make sure your book still works.
And that was one thing I didn't do. I didn't publish anything about tests in my book. I didn't do any, talk about unit tests other than that were necessary, because again, it's a big topic and it deserves another whole book by itself. So a chapter would have done a disservice to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that would eat up a lot of space in your book too.
Yeah, but and it would be, kind of be a change of direction. Suddenly you break off the topic and you're off on something else. And I did
Yeah.
that once already with the database work.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and I know you're not currently like teaching students, but now with all of this AI stuff, let's say you had all that stuff back when you were teaching, how would you think that would change, how you teach, or
I
how do you think it'll impact students now?
Well, I think I use ChatGPT now to try to help me solve problems in areas that I don't know, things that
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning in programming. Um, I think, like most things, most new things, it's a double-edged sword. I think it'd be really
Yep.
useful to a teacher and to students in a programming class. Uh, I think I experienced this problem not with ChatGPT, but similar things. When I was
Mm-hmm.
teaching at a STEM place, the kids would learn a new thing. Like they would suddenly the light bulb would go on, the aha moment when they
Mm-hmm.
realize what's possible with what I'm teaching, and then they would fixate on that and do it variations of it like 100 times. It was hard to
Yep.
get them to like move on to another topic, and I think that ChatGPT offers an opportunity like tenfold for students to essentially go down the rabbit hole. They ask GPT something about what they're learning, and then they're
Mm-hmm.
off. They're off on a tangent, and it's. I think it would be. It was for me. It's difficult to get their attention back with the next topic because they're busy
Yeah.
creating interesting and cool variations of the thing that they've learned now.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
I know when I was teaching the kids. I used the turtle module so that we could get graphics on the screen right away because I thought that would be
Mm-hmm.
more of a attention grabber than just teaching dry text programming.
Yep.
Um, so I would teach them. I taught them how to create a function that would draw a box with the turtle, and then we had a variation where you could change the number of sides, and it would automatically figure out how to draw a pentagram, a hexagram, and well,
Mm.
before you know it, kids were drawing, 1,000-sided boxes, and they thought that was the coolest thing, and they just wouldn't quit.
That's fun. Man, I've got to play with the turtle module some more. The person I interviewed earlier this month, Stephen Gruppetta, uses the turtle module a lot, and he does some really cool things with it.
Oh, it's amazing.
He's figured out how to do animations with it and lunar
Yeah,
landing, and I'm like, man, I definitely need to check this thing out.
it's very cool. It's a different way of thinking about drawing, but it's very cool stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, related to that, what do you think? What did you see that was tripping students up the most when they were learning about programming?
It's kind of surprised me, but everything about teaching students surprises me. What's difficult and what I take for granted, and it just points
Yep.
out that I've been doing this too long. Uh, but one of the things that I use is I wrote a little presentation about what I consider the four pillars of programming.
Hmm.
Loops, conditionals, and statements. Um,
Okay.
and it's easy for me, and I'm sure the same for you, to take for granted what a variable is. Well, I found that when I was teaching kids, and I was teaching kids from age 8 to the age of 15, so
Okay.
young kids. And the thing that we would get stuck on a lot was the concept of a variable, the abstraction of a variable name relating to the thing that it's, the value that it represents. And that abstraction was kind of tough to get over. They were much more comfortable using literals, like literal strings, literal numbers, and stuff.
Yeah.
But the idea of keeping track of something that's changing constantly but has a fixed name
Mm,
tough concept to get over. And then,
yeah.
if I got to a point where I felt like, okay, people are getting it, then you move on to something like a Python list, where now it's a single name that refers to many things, only some of which maybe keep changing at a time, or a dictionary,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'd it'd be another stumbling block for a little while till we could sort of get people's minds wrapped around the idea of like, oh, this is um, I used to do it with post-it notes. We'd do this sort of human programming where the kids would run around with post-it
Yeah.
notes of the variable and like be changing crossing out a value on the post-it note, writing a new value, and that's the variable that they
Mm,
hand off to somebody else. I'm not sure if it helped them or not, but that's the kind of thing that I would use in the class.
I think that's a good object lesson. And
Yeah,
kind of makes it more real.
yeah,
So I know in university, learning to program was really hard that first year or two. You're like, what does all this information even mean? All this
yeah.
terminology and abstractness,
Oh, I know. I
and
got hung up on. I took a C class, a C and C++ class ages ago, and I was already doing C++, and I
hmm
failed because it was it was in this weird instance of C++ on a Linux box I didn't really know at all. I was working in Windows, and
mm,
the way the whole so just the technology or the infrastructure of building a program. How does the linker work? How does a make file work?
yep,
Uh, how do you connect all these various different parts together? That was like there was so much overhead just to actually get to the point where you could write a program that would actually do something.
yeah, crazy. Totally get it though, because it's very different on Linux versus Windows.
Oh yeah, yeah. Windows. Like I said, I was working on embedded systems in Windows, and like I said, 95% of the time I just spent chasing crashes.
Yep. Well, cool. Anyway, I thought that was a really good conversation about your book and what you've been doing lately.
Thanks, Mike. It was fun for me too.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and just spending all this time with me to talk about your
Of
career
course.
and what you've been up to. So, anyway, I want to thank our listeners for listening to the Python Show, and I hope you all will come back, and hopefully Doug will come back too,
Yeah,
and
that'd
we
be
can do
great.
this again sometime.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off for now, but thanks for coming.
All right.
The Python Show.